Today, I'm gonna teach you how to connect to database using Spring Data and H2 library in just 5 steps. So let's get started. So, first step, we need to generate a Spring project using Spring Initializer. So how to do that? Just go to start.spring.io, and then here you will be introduced to a couple of options on how you will generate the Spring project. In my case, I want to generate a Gradle project, write a Java program, and just use the default Spring Boot version, which is 2.2.6. And in project metadata, make sure that you update fields accordingly to your needs. And for the packaging, it's up to you if you want to use jar or war. In my case, jar is enough, and I'm going to use Java version 8. The next thing that we need to add is the dependencies for our Spring project. Remember that we were trying to create a Spring project using Spring Data module and H2 library, correct? So let's get started and add those libraries to our dependency. So let's add GPA, and we also need the H2 library. Now that we have all of the fields filled up and the dependencies Spring Data GPA and H2 database, let's generate the project. So just click on the button generate. After we download the generated zip file from the Spring IO, copy it and paste it into our workspace. Now let's just unzip the zip file to our workspace. How to do that? Click extract here, and then now we have the folder named after our project, simple GPA data. Now we want to import the project into Eclipse. So let's do that. Just click File, then Import, find Gradle, and then click on the existing Gradle project. Click Next, and then Next, and just put the simple data GPA directory into the project root directory field. Then click Finish. Now that we were able to import our project into Eclipse IDE, let's make sure that it is actually building and running accordingly. So how to do that? Click over here, execute clean. After the command, execute the build, and let's wait until the build is done. Okay, now we were able to build, clean and build the project and run it, right? So after that, let's try to now we are now done at step 1. We were able to generate the project and clean and build it in our Eclipse IDE. Now let's go to our next step. Now the next step is that we need to enable our H2 console. So how do we do that? Let's go to our application.properties and just add this simple property to enable. So just type spring.h2.console.enable, and let's enable it. So the value is true. And now, after we were able to update and add spring.h2.console.enable to our application.properties, we also need to register a servlet to our Spring. So how do we do that? So we need to declare a servlet registration bean and register it to our Spring runtime. To do that, let's define a method which will be annotated at bean, by at bean. To register a servlet, we need to write a few codes. So I have a copy of a simple code snippet where I am able to register a servlet bean from the H2 library. To make sure that the H2 library is in your compile time, you need to update your Gradle dependency. Change it from runtime to compile time. How to do that? Let's check to our Project Explorer. As you can see, some of the web servlet classes is not found in compile time. That is because the H2 library is not under compile and it's under runtime only. So we need to update the scope of our dependency and put it into compile time. The equivalent word is the implementation. So instead of runtime only, let's use implementation instead. And then let's refresh our project. How to do that? Let's refresh our project. Go here in Gradle, refresh Gradle project. Now we were able to add our H2 library in our compile time. As you can see, it is not throwing any error anymore. You can see that the servlet is here. The next issue that I can see is that we forgot to add the Spring Boot Starter Web module because we cannot solve the class servlet registration bean. So let's fix that. So now let's add the Spring Boot Starter Web module in our Gradle dependency. To do that, let's type some code in here. And now we were able to add the Spring Boot Starter Web module in our dependency. So now let's refresh our Gradle project. The reason that the servlet registration bean is not being resolved because it's already been deprecated from an older version. Favor of the new class servlet registration being. So let's replace servlet registration this package to the new one. Let's change or update the package of the servlet registration bean. How to do that? Let's say web, and then the class registration bean is now resolved. So it's saved. Let's compile the program so that we can run it. So how to do it? So take a look at the Gradle task and just click on the build. Then let's wait until the build process is done. And now let's run our Spring application to see if it's the H2 console is working. So let's wait until the Spring already started. Okay, the Spring Boot successfully started. Now let's open our H2 console in the browser. So let's go to our browser and type localhost 8080 H2 console. So let's hit that. After entering the path to our H2 console, you can see that there is a login page that requires you to at least enter the driver class and the JDBC URL. Of course, just leave all of them as default. So just click connect. Like any other SQL client, you should be able to create your own SQL statements and then run it in here. Okay, so we finished step 2. Let's go to step 3, which is to create our own simple DDL SQL statements. And how do we do that? Let's go back to our Eclipse IDE and create a new file under resource folder named data.sql. Just click on the resource package and then right click on it. Let's create a new file. Name it data.sql. So first, we need to create DDL. So let's create a simple table. How to do that? Using DDL, create table person. Let's add fields or columns. So what are the fields that we want? First, ID, name, and address. So the ID must be an integer, correct? This must be a varchar and another varchar. Okay, so for the ID, it should be like ID integer not null. And then put comma. And then next for the name, say name space varchar. And we have to set the length of the varchar at least 255, and this must be null as well. And we should be able to do the same thing for the address. So just copy the varchar and not null statement after the address. And now we need to make sure that the ID is our primary key. And how to do that? Primary key is the ID. Simply just add the statement and pass the field name, which is the ID. So now we have created a simple DDL on how to create a person table. So now let's try to copy our DDL to our H2 console. How to do that? Let's run the boot run. The Spring already started. And now that the Spring started, let's copy our DDL and go to our H2 console. Let's go to our browser where we have the console and let's refresh it, connect, and then let's paste our DDL statement. Then let's run it. So H2DB throw an exception. It means that the person is already exists. How is it possible that the person table is already created? So let's take a look back on our IDE. Remember that we create a file data.sql, and over there we create and write our simple DDL to create the table person. This is the magic of our dependency Spring Boot starter data GPA. So what it does is that during the startup, as the name suggests, starter collects file in the class path. During startup, Spring Boot starter data GPA looks up at the resource or during startup, Spring Boot starter data GPA library looks up at the class path and see if there is a .sql file. And now, if the library sees that, or the auto configuration class sees that there is a data.sql file, it uses the file to automatically create the person table. There is a lot more details about how the starter works and how does it able to create the table during the startup. But for now, what you need to know that is all the Spring Boot Starter Data GPA does, and that's the magic that it do during the startup. The next thing we want is to populate our tables with data. So how do we do that? Since we were able to create our DL, now we want to create our SQL. So now I added a few SQL statements into our data.sql file. I wanted to add at least 2 entries for which the name is Mark and the other one is Marcus. Now make sure that the primary key or the ID is unique, so we don't want duplicate. To make sure, let's change the second entry to 2. Now let's start and run the Spring application using the command boot run, correct? Now that we were able to start our Spring application, let's check our H2 console in the browser. So let's go back to our H2 console browser and let's refresh it. So just go to localhost 8080 console and then just connect to it. And then after that, let's check if the table person is populated with data entries that we add in our data.sql. So how to do that? Just write the select all from person SQL and then hit run. As you can see, the data that we added, the SQL that we added in our data.sql reflected in our DB console. So this is the name Mark and Marcus. Check again if it's really the data from our data.sql. Let's go to our IDE, check for the file data.sql. So the first entry is Mark, the second entry is Marcus. If you go here in the browser, the first data is Mark, the second one is Marcus. So it's correct. Okay, that's good. So now we are done at step 3. Let's proceed to step 4. Start writing some Java code that is the entity and our GPA repository. So for the sake of example, let's just create our person entity in this package. So just hit right click and create a new class. Find the Java class. What's the name of our entity? That is person. So let's click and then after that, let's annotate our person with what? At entity. Okay, that is Java assistance. We can actually name it with name of the table person. But do I need to set the name of the entity? No, because the name of the table matches the name of my class. So we don't need to do this anymore. So let's just remove that. Next, we need to add our fields. What are the fields? Private, long, or maybe just int is enough. Okay, so let's just make it long. ID. Now, since our ID is our primary key, we want it to be auto-generated and tell the GPA that this is our primary ID. So we need to annotate it with what? ID. And then generated value. And let's tell the GPA that we want the value for ID auto-generated. So let's set that strategy generation type dot auto. Alright? And for the other fields, name, private, string, name. The next one, private string address. We need to add at least one constructor for this entity class. So how to do that? Person. So we don't need to include the ID in our constructor as argument because it's auto-generated. We only need the what? Name and the address. And then just set the value address. And then let's create our getter and setter. And now we have all of our getters for each of our fields. And just remember that for the ID, we actually don't want the primitive type. We want the object type, which is the long. So let's do the same thing in here in our method, long. And then let's add toString. Generate toString. So just right click, find source, generate toString. And include ID, name, and address. So click generate. Okay, that's good. So now the next thing we want to do is to create our CRUD repository. So let's click on this package and create our CRUD repository. Let's create a new class and let's name it person repository. And then let's implement CRUD repository. Extends rather. So we need to extend CRUD. Okay, so now we added a new class person repository and extends CRUD repository. So we need to pass type person and long in here. So let's take a look at the CRUD repository inside. You can see in CRUD repository interface, there are already a couple of methods that is available for you to use during runtime. All you need to do during you extend the interface. Now, after we created the file person repository.java, just change it to interface. So now after creating the file person repository.java, let's just change the class to interface. The reason is that we need to extend another interface, and the interface is CRUD repository. Correct. It's actually a generic interface. So the first parameter should be your entity. And what is our entity name? Person. The next one is our primary key type. So in our case, it's long. Let's take a quick look in our CRUD repository. So in this interface, as you can see, there are already a couple of methods that is provided for us, ready to use during runtime. The only thing that we need to do during the time that we extend the CRUD repository is to just create our own method based on our own need. In my case, I want to return a list of person that contain a string under name. So let's type a code here, list, and I want to return person, list of person, and find person by name, or should I say contains name. Okay, let's just stick with name by name. All right. So for us to be able to find list of person, we need to pass an argument, and the argument name. So that is the parameter that we need so that we can return a list of person. Let's add another method. For example, I wanted to return a person based on the ID given. So let's return the person, find by ID, and let's pass the ID of the person. So now we are seeing some compiler error in here. It seems that the find by ID is already written in the CRUD repository. So let's check on that. As you can see, let's find it, find by ID. So there is already a method find by ID in the parent interface. So let's just not or change the method name instead. So find person by ID. So now it's all gone. After building it and executing the test, there seems to be an error in the test that it's causing failure. So let's check what is the failure. So in here, as you can see, in the gradle execution, there seems to be an error. It says table person already exists in SQL. Now, this is the most common error that you will encounter when you first try to create your own Spring Data app. So what you can do is that you can go back to your data.sql file. In here, in the data.sql, instead of directly creating the table, let's add a new DDL instead to make sure that we have a clean database during startup, correct? What is the table that we want to drop during the startup of the application? That is a table person. Alright, so let's build again the program and see if the error. After cleaning, I executed the build, and as you can see, the error is gone. And now we were able to build our first Spring Data application. So now we are finished step 4. Let's proceed to our next step, the final step, step 5, okay? So the final step is actually really simple. We just wanted to test if the database running correctly. So how do we do that? So let's go back here in our simple GPA data application, and then in here let's add a method that will return a bean of command line runner. So now I added a simple method annotated with @bean, which will return a bean of command line runner, and this this method will accept a person repository bean. So this is actually an instance created during start. Let's start. Let's implement the anonymous class for the command line runner, and then we want to test if there are entries in our database. So we want to execute a query that will return a list of person. How do we do that? So let's try this. Person repo dot find all. So this method will return a list of. So let's see what it will return. List of person, because it's iteratable. So what we can do, create a list of persons. Assign the value to this variable person. So there seems to be a type mismatch happening here. The find all method, it returns an iteratable, but we are expecting a collection list. So to fix this, we can actually just simply create our own method in person repository. So let's go to this repository and just add a new method which will return all of our person. So get all persons. Now we have a new method, get all persons, which is actually much more nicer to hear because the method name is more closer to the context that we are talking about, which is person. So let's use this method. So let's go back here. Let's change the find all method to get all persons. Okay, and that's good. So now we have all the persons. So let's check system.out that println. So we are actually expecting at least 2%, right, during the startup. So now what we want to do is to at least print the size of the list, and we are actually expecting 2, correct? And then let's try to print each person into the command prompt. How to do that? So let's just say person dot string, then let's do for each. So p, let's do it again. Okay, so now we have the p, which is the person. So let's say system.out.println, and then let's pass the p. Remember that the p person, we already implemented the toString. So let's check it out again. If it's already implemented, yes it is, toString. So when we pass the person object to our println, it will call the toString method. So let's run the program and check it's running correctly. Now after we build the program, there seems to be an error. So let's find out. So it seems that there is a problem when we created the method getAllPersons. So what we can do, let's just go back to the repository class and just add default implementation for our method. As you can see, I already created and added a default implementation for my method. And behind about it actually calls the findAll method. Now the findAll method is part of the code repository. And for each, because since this iteratable, I just iterate to each item and then add it to my new collection person. And then after that, I return the persons from the caller. So after we build, there's another error that we encounter. It seems that the simple GPA data that person entity is having an issue. It doesn't have any default constructor. Remember that we add a constructor, right, with two arguments? This time we need to add a default one without an argument. After building, it seems that we encounter another error. It seems that the person entity needs a default constructor. So let's add a constructor to our person entity. So let's go to our person class and then let's just add a default constructor. So just add person. Now it's done. Let's go back and build our project. So let's wait a couple of moments until the build finishes. Now the build seems to be a success. So let's go back and what happened. See in the console. Let's check if it's printing. Not yet because it was just a build. Of course, correct. So what we need is to execute the boot run. So let's go and execute boot run. So just click boot run. Here and let's wait until it's done. Now after running the boot run seems to be okay and it's printing all of our entries from the database, Mark and Marcus. So let's try to add more entries around it and print it again. So to add a new person, we need to create a person instance, correct? So new person. So is equal to new and let's pass what we need to pass in the person constructor. That should be the name and the string, name and address, correct? So name is shell, address same, passing. All right, and then let's add this new person to our database. So how to do that? Just save and then just pass the new person. Then let's run boot run again and see if it's printing 3 entries. So first of course you need to close and run it again. Okay, so let's wait a couple of moments until it's done. Okay, so as you can see, we were able to insert a new record entry for person to our database and the ID was auto-generated. By default, it will start to ID 1. As you can see, the name is shell and the address is passive. And when we query all the entries from the database, say like get all the persons, now it returns 3 of them, correct? Now we finished all 5 steps on how to create a simple Spring GPA app, Spring Data GPA app. Just for recap, all that we need to do is that we need to only to generate the Spring data using the Spring initializer. And then after that, you need to set up your H2 console. And then we created our own data.sql coming over here and write our own PDL and SQL. And then after that, we created our own CRUD repository and person entity. And then after that, we write some codes to make sure that we were able to add a new entry to database and query all of the persons from the database and print it out in the console. That's all for the easy 5 steps on creating or writing Spring Data GPA. Subscribe to my channel. Thanks.